wrong slides up there. Now, do we have the Lena Valley crew with us? And I want to say a big welcome to everybody also through Facebook and ultimately through YouTube who may be watching our sermon today. It is nice to be home. I've had a whirlwind couple of weeks over in Canada. It really was a very special time. Both we're doing a foundations course and working on the development of foundations with a team there, and going back to my former church, my Canadian church family, and preaching again in my old church, and it was really encouraging. By the way, yeah, kids here at both sites, the energy kids. I do miss the Eye of the Tiger intro. We used to have that when the kids were out. We won't look at that again, but kids, it is time for you to exit stage right. And it was interesting while I was in Canada. Like it was a bit overwhelming catching up with so many friends. One of the friends I caught up with was a lady by the name of Angie Dedrick. She was the council officer for the city of St Albert, and she and I became really good friends after. My task, the St Albert Alliance Church had been on this journey, and they said, look, we need someone to help us think differently about mission. And they created a big open job description they called the Pastor for Community Engagement and Mission, and that was the job I had. And so I was engaging with the city, and the officer at the city, Angie, and I became good friends. And that friendship was solidified, where she actually came to me and introduced me to a Christian book that I hadn't come across before. I don't know if you've got to get this on the camera, guys, but this is the book, The Art of Neighbouring, Building Genuine Relationships Right Outside Your Door. And it was the basis of a whole lot of work we did, working in partnership with all the local churches in St Albert to see if we could work out what does it mean to help our people actually love their neighbours. And as a result of that, we had up to, I think it was about, in 1 year, 150 block parties as people actually started to just get to know the names of their neighbours. Now, this book actually came out of a challenge from a local mayor. There was a group of pastors who wanted to do something big and heroic for their city, to do something that was going to really make a difference. And so they said, okay, well let's pick one of the core issues that could really make a difference. And they got the local mayor in and said, look, we really want to make a difference. We're the churches. We're here to make a difference in the city. What can we do? And they were thinking about, there were some pretty critical issues. But the mayor looked them in the eyes and said, you know what would actually make a difference? If you could just get your people to be good neighbours. Now I'll read what the pastor wrote, and this is in the book. After the mayor left the meeting that day, our group of pastors was left to reflect on what he'd shared. I can remember sitting there, and before I could think, I just blurted out, am I the only one here who's a little bit embarrassed? I mean, here we are asking the mayor how we can best serve the city, and he basically tells us it would be great if we could just get our people to obey the second half of the Great Commandment. In a word, the mayor invited a room full of pastors to get their people to actually obey Jesus. And so it was on the basis of that book that we took the action in St Albert, and it did seem to make a difference. And it was lovely to connect again with Angie. But it was, and connecting with so many friends. But it was interesting processing as last Saturday as I was preparing to preach at my old church, and to hear the news of Christchurch and try and make sense of that. What on earth could get a man to a point where he could look at this face and shoot him? What on earth could get a man to a point where he could see two rooms full of people and open fire. It does take a bit of processing. But I actually think it's the same force that means for most of us, we're not even conscious of what's happened in this past week in Mozambique. You know, so far, according to the tallies, as a result of the cyclone Idai, there have been more than 200 people killed in Mozambique, 56 dead in Malawi and 98 dead in Zimbabwe. In total, an estimated 2.6 million people could be affected, with hundreds of thousands made homeless. Why? You know, I don't know. It may be that you've been hearing that news and weeping as you've been hearing it and processing it. But for many of us, it was just another news story that we may or may not have even engaged with on the 6 o'clock news. I think that what Jesus was addressing with what became known as the Great Commandment is one of the greatest challenges we face. It's been interesting for me seeing I was just talking to one of my friends here, that in response to the murder in Christchurch, many Christians have been sharing news about murders in Nigeria and saying, well, we should be, you know, upset about that rather than that. Yeah, there is a particular responsibility we have to our brothers and sisters who are persecuted in the church. There is no question about that. But it's not we're not part of a club that somehow people over there being killed are worse than people over there being killed. It's horrific. And we need to face the forces in us that would allow us to value one human being more than another. It is a natural part of being a human being, but it's not a right part of being a human being. The great enemy of our time, in my view, is the dehumanisation. David Livingston Smith says, dehumanisation isn't a way of talking. It's a way of thinking. A way of thinking that sadly comes all too easy to us. That's why, as I continue with this quote, I want us not just to talk abstractly about the Great Commandment, but to hear Jesus' words and understand just how revolutionary probably his simplest teaching actually is, and how much it actually confronts us. It does come too easily to us to dehumanise. Dehumanisation, this sociologist says, as he's trying to work out what's going on with the world from a secular perspective, he says, is a scourge and has been so for millennia. It acts as a psychological lubricant, dissolving our inhibitions and inflaming our destructive passions. As such, it empowers us to perform acts that would under other circumstances be unthinkable. That shooter was able to do what he did because he wasn't seeing people. We have been able to hear about Mozambique because it's easy to distance ourselves. It's harder to identify with the mums over there that have lost their kids, the kids that have lost their grandparents, and the families that have lost their homes, because they're a bit different to us. It's easier to identify with people who are like us than people who are not like us. And so into that natural human tendency, Jesus gives what it becomes known as the Great Commandment. We get the picture in Matthew 22 that the Pharisees were going, okay, we're going to trap you. We're going to get you sorted out here. And one of them comes up and says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replies, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it." It's interesting. In philosophy at the time, they were talking about the unum necessarium, the one thing necessary. They're saying, look, how do you distill all these different laws and things? How do we make it into, how do we know, how do we prioritize? And you feel sorry, like you understand, I don't remember the exact number, but there were, for a Jewish an observant Jew, there were 300 laws they needed to keep conscious of, and about 700 statutes that they needed to be conscious of. So you understand them wanting to boil it all down. And he says, okay, what's the one thing? Jesus says, here's the one thing. And then he gives them two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commitments. Jesus invites us to approach life, not dividing the world into us and them, but to live our lives from the basis of love. That our relationship to God is not a relationship to sometimes we can think, oh gee, I've got to obey all the rules, and there's a bad man in the sky who's going to wrap me over the knuckles when I don't get it right. No, we've got to understand we will be healthy not when we're scared of what the consequences of doing the wrong thing because we're scared God's going to wrap us over the knuckles, but when we can come to God and say, Abba, Father, I love you. Where we can come to God from a position of love and not fear. But that we can also, as Jesus says, come to our neighbours with a position of love and not fear. Jesus invites us to live a life of love for God and for our neighbours as much as for ourselves. I agree with a fellow called M. Scott Peck, who said in the book The Road Less Travelled, call it what you will, genuine love with all the discipline it requires is the only path in this life to substantial joy. When I genuinely love, I am extending myself, and when I'm extending myself, I'm growing. The more I love, the longer I love, the larger I become. Notice that the people who tend to divide the world into us and them, who see them as the enemy, tend to be small people. God invites us to love because we are people who are created in his image, and we are only ourselves when we are loving. The more I move to fear and hate, the more and more I move away from who I'm created to be. It's not surprising. I've actually taken this next passage from the New Living Translation because it captures, sometimes the New Living gives you a more easily accessible version of what the text is saying. And what it says, the Great Commandment turns up in Luke. And we get this story only in the book of Luke. And we get this insight to the Pharisee who asked him the question. He found it a little confronting. And it says in the New Living, the man wanted to justify his actions. That wouldn't be us, would it? We'd never be like that. The man wanted to justify his actions. So he said to Jesus, yeah, okay, but who is my neighbour? No worries, I'll love my neighbour. Just tell me, where's the boundaries? Who don't I need to love? is what he's asking there. And Jesus replies with a story that challenges us. It is this. A Jewish man was travelling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. What is offensive about this, as Jesus tells the story, is that the priest is meant to be God's representative here on earth. He's like saying, if Jesus was here and talking to Citywide Baptist Church, he would say, well, you're pastor at Citywide Baptist Church. That's kind of someone you identify with and should be a representative of what God is saying. That's what he's saying. Someone who should know. And what does he do? He sees the pain and walks to the other side. Then, a temple assistant whose job it is to help people do the work to restore their relationship with God. A temple, to help people meet God. That's a temple assistant's job. Of course, surely this one, whose whole vocation is about bringing people to God, surely they won't do it. But Jesus very specifically tells the story. A temple assistant walks over and looks at him lying there. Sees the pain. But he also passed by the other side. Then, to bring out the weight of the Greek text, the New Living is, I think, pretty accurate when it says, then a despised Samaritan. And again, if Jesus was here, I'm fairly sure the closest thing we have for Jewish people to Samaritans would be Muslims. So hear this. Jesus is saying, so then a Muslim comes. And if he's talking to evangelical Christians, part of us would want to protest and say, hang on, no, we've got the way, the truth, and the life. We've got it sorted. Then a Muslim comes. And he saw the man. And what? He felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now, Jesus looks them in the eyes and says, now you tell me. You tell me. Which of these 3 would you say was a neighbour to the man who was attacked by bandits? The ones who had the right theology? Or the one who made a choice to love? The teacher, the Pharisee, replied, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus looks him in the eyes and says, now you've got the right ideas, go and live from those right ideas. No, he doesn't. He says, now go and do the same. Live from love. And in particular, he makes it clear that we are to love people who are different to us. This is actually a key to what the church is meant to be. This is where all the angst came in the New Testament, as Jewish people had to create space for Gentiles and barbarians and people who are not like them. The church is meant to be a place that builds bridges to people who are not like them, bridges of love, not bridges of theological argumentation. What does love look like? Well, Jesus shows as he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, the first thing the Good Samaritan does is what the other two do, but try and move on quickly. The Good Samaritan sees. To love is to see. I think one of the dangers with what's happened in Mozambique is most of us haven't seen it. It's been there in the background as the wallpaper of our lives this past week or so. We just haven't seen it, so we haven't been able to care. He sees. Then what does he do? He allows himself to feel compassion. It is disturbing a bit to feel compassion for people who aren't like you, because it challenges your prejudices. And you got to know there are prejudices you have because we're human beings. The word prejudice is the word prejudge. We prejudge each other. And if we're fair dinkum on this journey of faith, we need to allow Jesus to take us by the hand, and what he will do is, can you watch, he'll continually bring us to places that confront our prejudices and invite us to love each other within the church, and that takes a fair bit of work, and to love people who are not like us outside the church. So he feels compassion, and then he acts out of the care. He actually goes to the person. I want to encourage you, the church was never meant to be a holy huddle. If you don't know people who are outside the church, then that is actually a problem. Jesus says, it's by this will all men know that you are my disciples, that you love each other. What that presupposes is that people outside the church know you well enough to watch how you love people. We'll talk more about that as we go on. You'll find it's a major theme, certainly for me, as I keep wrestling with what does it mean for us to love Hobart. It doesn't mean to put on such a good performance that everybody wants to come and see a good performance. It means for us to actually learn to love Hobart. And one of the dangers is when we try to say we love everybody, it's really easy to end up loving nobody. It's safer to use the word love than to actually do what it means. At the end of every one of our services, we sort of send each other out and we say we want to be the church in the places where we live, where we learn, where we work, and where we play. What that means is God has you in these places, and it means actively moving towards loving relationship in each one of those places. And it's not simple. It is easier to hang out with people who think and talk and act like you. It is easier. It's just not what followers of Jesus get to do. And this world right now is becoming more and more polarised as people form clubs and argue about people in different sides of things, and we need people who can love people who are different to them, don't we? One of the things in that book that has been helpful for me is to say, look, just don't be too hard on yourself. Realise that the journey towards relationship is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It was really good for me to sit down with Sabri Sampson on Friday and just have coffee and talk. And we had a bit of a theological discussion about, the difference between Islam and Christianity, and he invited me around for a meal at his place. And relationship, one of the mistakes we in the church have made is we think evangelism is some kind of event we put on, and that we're meant to, always be putting on events. No. We're meant to be building relationships of love. And these... and people aren't dumb. If you are only building relationship in order to get a chance to do the sales pitch, people will spot it a mile off. We need to be the kind of people who actually love our neighbours. One of the core questions that comes out in that Art of Neighbouring book is this: what if, when Jesus said, love your neighbour, he actually meant love your neighbour? What if he actually meant love the person you live next door to, or you work in the cubicle next to, or the person you sit next to on the bus, or the kid in the classroom that everybody else is avoiding? What if he actually meant that? And wasn't just talking about some abstract philosophical idea called love. This Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon, who wrote this book, said the journey to relationship is in 3 phases. Love looks like it's a process. We start out in a world full of strangers, and then gradually, if, as you say, "G'day, how are you?" you move to being an acquaintance, and that's okay. You don't automatically dive into. And this is sometimes I think where we in the church have got it wrong. We've taken a whole bunch of strangers and tried to dive into deep relationship and talk about some of the most precious things in people's lives without doing the work of building relationship. You move from being a stranger to being an acquaintance to being in relationship. Again, I've taken another translation of the Bible because I think it takes the intent of what the writer of Acts was trying to say and helps bring it home, because it actually says something that, in a way that I hadn't heard before. This is Acts 17:26 to 27. From one man he made all the people of the world. Now they live all over the earth. He decided exactly when they should live. Did you know that it's not an accident that you're alive now? God decided the year, the day, the moment you'd be born. Not only that, did you think that you chose your house? Did you? For those who missed that, Levi just pointed out that Vicky actually chose the house, didn't it? Yeah, under guidance, absolutely. And it says in Acts, in the New International Reader's Version of the Bible, and again, the New International Reader's Version takes the Greek text and makes it accessible and easily to read out loud. That's what's the intent of it. He decided when they should live, and he decided exactly where they should live. God did this so that people would seek him. It's not an accident you live where you live. Have you got an annoying neighbour? For those in Lena Valley, we've got Gay here's pointing out. She's got a couple. Well, actually, I probably shouldn't say that. I don't. I probably shouldn't put that on the video, should I? But for many of us, it is not simple to live in a neighbourhood because some of our neighbours are hard work. For many of us, it's not simple to work in our workplace because some of the people we work with are hard work. Some of us who go to school or university, that's really challenging. It's not an accident you live where you do. And sometimes the most challenging place to be the church is actually the place where you live. Because one of the awkward things about your neighbours is, if hypothetically you would have an argument with your wife, not that you ever would, they might hear it. You know, or if you don't get around to mowing your lawn because you're too exhausted, they might notice. If your kids are coming home late at night and you may not look like the best parent in the world, again, hypothetically, your neighbours might notice. It's hard to put on a show with people who live near you all the time. That's exactly why loving your neighbours is so powerful. Angie, who is my friend in that's the St Albert City Council, put together a little graph that talked about the process of what does it mean to actually learn to love your neighbours. It's interesting. This St Albert City Council, this is it. It starts with meeting your neighbours, and down there's little dots there that you can see in that. And sometimes that's just the start. Like if you don't yet know the names of your neighbours, maybe the next step for you is just going to meet them, say hello. And then gradually getting to know your neighbours, then connecting with your neighbours, and then becoming a caring network of neighbours. We are to be a redemptive force of love in our neighbourhoods. Our street, the place where we live, should be better because we're there. Now that's challenging. Some of us live on acreages, so that our neighbours are a little bit away, or, some of us live near. Some of you are thinking, yeah, Matt, but you don't know my neighbour. I mean, if you knew my neighbour, it's interesting. Angie tried to map it, and she said, "Look, you can start with things like, there's the Howrah Tranmere social media thing, where you can you can swap notes. You can join like a social media network of people who live in your neighbourhood. Then the next step is if you can just get to know their names. I wonder, just a spot check, who would know the names of all their neighbours and their kids? That's actually, in a group this size, that's actually pretty good. What percentage would you say that is? I can't hear from Lena Valley. I'd be interested to know how many Lena Valley people are. But I think maybe 25%, maybe. That's actually very good. But that's an important step. In fact, one of the things early on when I was working with Fusion up in the town of Wynyard, they were having a youth crime problem. And one response was to hire security guards, which, funnily enough, didn't fix anything. But the statistics and research show the most effective thing you can do to reduce crime in a neighbourhood is if everybody knows each other's names. It really is that simple. It can be. Loving your neighbour starts with getting to know their names. And then you see this process, this little graph here that Angie put together. you start to have informal discussions or conversations about, the football and how St Kilda are going to win this afternoon. I don't feel the support in the room. You start to have you start to have informal discussions about like the weather, and you start to have conversation. Then you move to that. Then actually, eventually, you can do something as radical as holding a bit of a block party. Do you know that this coming Sunday marks Neighbour Day? Not today, but next week. And the council, the Clarence Council, and the Tasmanian Department of Health and Human Services are asking people to do stuff that helps their neighbours connect with each other. The council is asking you to do something like a block party or something that helps neighbours connect on International Neighbour Day. The council is asking us to do what Jesus asked us to do 2,000 years ago. In fact, the Department of Health and Human Services has got a $5,000 prize for people that help neighbours connect and have healthy food at it. I'm telling you, Jesus' teaching is so radical that all of us know it's important, but most of us avoid it. And all the social scientists are clear. In neighbourhoods where people love each other, everything improves. In fact, knowing your neighbours leads to an increased sense of belonging and well-being, to social networks of support, particularly for the kids in the neighbourhood. It leads to direct social improvements, like the place looks better and there are more facilities there for everybody. It leads to economic development. It leads to better physical and mental health, and it leads to lower crime rates. Loving your neighbour is the simplest teaching Jesus ever gave us. And it's a teaching that all the social sciences agree this is actually how we build healthy communities. And so much so the government will throw money at it. But for many of us, we are either too scared or too busy. And over the next weeks, we're going to address both those questions. What does it mean to have the time? What does it mean to face our fears? And also, what does it mean to step into the mess, the real mess of loving our neighbour? And I'm serious, next Sunday is Neighbour Day, and I want to encourage you to think, is there something I could do? Even if it's just dropping around some home cooking or offering to, mow someone's lawn who can't mow their own lawn. Do something on Neighbour Day next weekend. It is, at least the Clarence Council would be very excited, and the Hobart City Council and Department of Health and Human Services. But as we get to the close of this, the gunman was able to do what he did because he didn't love his neighbours. He didn't allow people who were different to him to enter his heart. He lived in an isolated little world and saw that people who don't think and talk and act like him are the enemy. And even if you can't love your neighbours, Jesus doesn't let us see it. Even if you see them as the enemy, Jesus' prescription is still the same. You still have to love them. He's very clear. You cannot be a follower of Jesus Christ and not love people who are different to you. You can call yourself a Christian, you're just not. So as we come to this, next week I'm going to be handing out something on a card that looks like this. We got this from this book, and it is just a square which represents your house. I'm going to invite you to take this little neighbour map. Oh yeah, it's up there on the screen. And write down the names of people who live around you. I just invite you to write them down. And if you don't know them, to get to know them, to write down, and just start praying for them. And start to get to know your neighbours. Start this journey. And we encourage you to chuck that up on your fridge, and just for it to be a simple tool that reminds you that you don't live in isolation, and you were never meant to live in isolation. We are called to love our neighbours, and it is even possible that when Jesus said love your neighbour, he may have actually meant, love your neighbour. What I've said before in the past is that one of the goals in getting to know people is to have a conversation that lasts 7 minutes. And that's your homework for this week. See if you can have a 7-minute conversation with a neighbour this week. Because generally speaking, what happens, you get to the 7 minutes, you can get through the first 7 minutes by talking about the weather and things but after 7 minutes, you'll find there's a bit of a lull in the conversation. And you actually start to get to know the person after 7 minutes, generally speaking. So that's your homework for this week. See if you can have a 7-minute conversation with a neighbour, and see if you can start to become more conscious of your neighbours, and maybe think about, doing something next weekend for the Neighbour Day. I want to follow up what Dan was saying and encourage you. Can you please think about reordering your priorities for Wednesday nights, the Wednesday nights in April? The 3rd, the 10th and the 17th. We're going to be here from... Actually, I'll change the time from 7 p.m. to 9:30 p.m, so we finish by 9:30, get home to bed. Only an hour and a half each night, Wednesday nights. And we're just going to spend 3 nights talking about what does it actually mean to love our neighbours. What does it actually look like? We're going to actually have some specific training about that. We're calling it Waking Up the Neighbourhood. It's a little course that I developed and taught in Canada. We'll be changing it a bit for here. Wednesday nights, 3rd, 10th, 17th of April, 7 p.m. to 9:30. And then can I ask you again to organise your life to be with us in Lena Valley on the 25th for Anzac Day. To come, it's a chance for us both, and I'm asking the crew here at Mornington and the crew at Lena Valley and also our Nepalese congregation to reorder their priorities to be with us on Anzac Day to serve the community. There's something about coming and leading the community in a commemoration of a pretty significant moment. Who was there last year? If you weren't there, can you just talk to someone with their hand up and ask them about it? Because I think it is one of the simplest and best things we do. And it's all about what does it mean to love our neighbours. We're going to keep talking about this. Like I said, the most challenging teachings in the Bible are not complicated. We've got to keep talking about what does it mean to actually love our neighbours. Because it's not about your intellectual, oh yeah, I understand what that means. It's about actually doing it. And as we now come to communion, so I invite our stewards to get the communion ready. Look, we've got to acknowledge that it is true that some people are really hard to love. It is true. The more you open yourself and genuinely love, the more you open yourself to being hurt. That is true. But we love not because we're special or clever. We love because He first loved us. what we celebrate with communion. I'll invite our stewards to actually come and just hand out the cracker and the juice that are this symbol. Jesus came and showed us what love looks like. His goal wasn't to create a people full of the right ideas. His goal was to create people that loved God with all their heart and their soul and their mind, and people who actually loved their neighbour as themselves. There's a quote that I use over and over again from this guy who did a lot of work on what the mission of the church is. And it's kind of one of those books that if you go to seminary or if you study mission in any way in the church, you'll have to read. His name's David Bosch. He was a South African guy. And he studied the whole journey of the church over 2,000 years. And he said, look, we've often mistook mission for what missionaries do. We've misunderstood. You know, the word missionary doesn't appear in the Bible. The word mission just means sent. And I don't know how to break the news to you. You are sent. You are sent into your neighbourhoods. You are sent into your workplaces. You are sent into the places where we live, learn, work and play. You are sent. And he said this, mission is the good news of God's love, incarnated or made real in the witness of a community for the sake of the world. What does that mean? It means we need to be open to God's love and to live it. And to live it. So that the world may know the life that is only available in and through Jesus Christ. And Jesus knew how he worked. That's why on the night he was betrayed, Jesus took a little bit of flat bread in which there was no yeast. And he knew. He knew how quickly we would become full of ourselves. He knew how easy it would be for us to dehumanize others. And on the night he was betrayed, he took the bread and said, "This is my body, broken for you." Do this in remembrance of me. So let's take this and eat together. Then, after supper, he took the cup. And he announced that a revolution had taken place. He said, "This cup is the new covenant." The new way. This cup represents that there is a new way of relating to God. There is a new way to be a human being. A way based on love and not on self-interest. A way made by what I am about to do on the cross. He says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." Let's drink together. Let's pray. Jesus, as we come, we just want to say thanks. Thanks for who you are. Thank you for your example of love and what your love means for us. Forgive us for the temptation to divide the world into us and them. to somehow think that some lives are more valuable than others. Forgive us for the crime of dehumanization. And Jesus, please keep shaping our hearts, calling us out, and helping us actually love our neighbours. We bring to mind now those people we find it hard to love. We bring to mind some of our actual neighbours, their faces, their names. And Jesus, we ask that you use us to express your love to them. Even if it's not simple. And Jesus, we ask that you help us just keep remembering that we can love because you loved us. That love isn't an expression of something we work up, but as we open ourselves to the life that is only available in and through you, we step into a life of love. Help us love Jesus. Help us be a community marked by love. Help us be people who create space for people who are not like us. And as we do that, please shape us more and more into your image. We ask this in your name. Amen.